All right, folks, how you doing? Welcome back. So this is William Wallace, Robin Hood Revealed, Part 5. Disclaimer: under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, research, etc. Guardian of Scotland. So this is beginning with the conclusion of the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Attacking from Stirling Castle, Earl Malcolm and his Lennoxmen routed the English troops across the other side of the Forth. The bridge was soon repaired, and the Scots chased the English all the way to Dunbar, 70 miles to the east. This battle was a complete disaster for England. Wallace held Parliament soon after and made the Scottish nobles swear fealty to him as Guardian of Scotland. Marching on Corspatrick's lands. Earl Corspatrick refused Wallace's summons, choosing to remain loyal to King Edward, mocking Wallace as the King of Kyle. Wallace gathered an army and marched on his lands. Meanwhile, Corspatrick sent word to his allies in England, Bishop Beck and Robert the Bruce. Still bitter from his humiliating rout at Glasgow, remember the Battle of the Bell of the Bray? Beck relished the opportunity to get even with Wallace and raised a large army. The Spotismere. Despite enjoying initial success against Corspatrick, Wallace was unable to corner him before Beck and the Bruce arrived, trapping Wallace on an open field at the Spotismere, where he was heavily outnumbered. Wallace and his men bravely stood their ground at first, but were forced to retreat when Beck's reinforcements showed up. And if I'm not mistaken, this was almost at exactly the same place as the Battle of Dunbar, which I talked about in Part 1 in 1296. So within a couple of years, Wallace again finds himself where the Scots army was routed at Dunbar, and this time he's routed again. So every time he goes to this one particular area just outside of Dunbar, it never ends very well for him. Must have felt like deja vu. But this time the Scots army was not completely routed. They retreated in good order, and lived to fight another day. Lammermuir Hills. So Wallace managed to catch Corspatrick, Beck and Bruce off guard soon after and defeated them in the Lammermuir Hills, pretty much an ambush. With this victory, Wallace's authority was now absolute. The whole of Scotland was now firmly behind him. He decided it was time to take the war to the enemy. He marshalled the largest army ever seen in Scottish history. Well, up until that point anyway. A 40-day truce. Wallace went on the offensive, laying waste to northern England. No English knight, lord or captain seemed able to stop him. Before long, they had reached the suburbs of York. Emissaries of King Edward came to him, asking for a 40-day truce, giving the English time to gather an army to face Wallace and his army on an open field. Attack on York. So after the agreed upon time was up, Wallace attacked York in an all-out assault. The Scots failed to storm the town, and the fighting ended in a truce, which is usually what happened, by the way, in medieval times. Storming the town, that's rarely what happened. More often than not, this is what would happen. The flag of Scotland was flown atop the town walls for a few hours to signal that the Scots had won, the Scots victory. Really, it was more like they agreed to give up. The Scots didn't slaughter everyone. It's just that the folk in York realised that, they had more in common, probably, being Northern English, with the Scots than they did with London. But that's subject for another time. In the meantime, King Edward had convened his parliament and made ready to gather an army. However, they argued that they could only meet Wallace on an open field if he were to be crowned the King of Scots. There's quite a lot to unpack in that. I mean, Wallace's own maternal ancestors, the Crawfords, came from Northumbria, from Northern England. I've made a video about that before. And the Northern English, the Anglo-Saxons, they, in many ways, I think, really felt more, I don't know what the term would be, but they were more loathing of London than they were Edinburgh, if I can put it like that, because, remember the Norman conquest, William the Conqueror's wars against the north of England and all this. And, well, I'll go into it in the video. You can watch it about Thor Longus. It's all explained there. It's all unpacked. But, the folk in York, in that part of North England, what's really middle North England, They'd be more willing to negotiate a truce with Wallace than the Normans, the Plantagenets in London, because there wasn't exactly a kinship or a friendship between the Northumbrian Anglo-Saxons and the Britons, the Celts, and all this. But there wasn't that level of outright antagonism. You have to really go into English history and blame the conqueror to really flesh that out. But this ploy here by Edward and his parliament is pretty clever, but it's also pretty obvious. And it ties into what I'm saying here. Wallace, even his name gives away his lineage from Wallace, or Welsh, Britain, in other words. He was a more ancient lineage than many of the Scottish nobles at the time, and he was of middling birth, which I go into in the future slides. I'm maybe getting a bit ahead of myself here, but Wallace had no legitimate claim on the crown, and he didn't really want it anyway. But this is a very clever ploy by the English to divide the Scots from within, because they're getting their asses handed to them at this point. King in all but name. So since Wallace was a minor noble of middling birth, and he was a middle son as well, he wasn't even the oldest, he held no legitimate claim to the Scottish crown. Well, he held no claim to the Scottish crown whatsoever. Wallace himself thought it would be a disgrace for him to claim kingship. Many of Wallace's supporters cried out for him to accept the crown, deeming no other man more worthy. And in reality, Wallace was already pretty much king in all but name. Well, the way he was acting, I don't mean like wearing the crown or issuing royal decrees or anything like that, but he's, the leader of the army. In medieval times, the king would lead the army. That's what I mean by that. The king would be the head of the army, and Wallace is very much the head of the army. And his authority after defeating Corpatrick and Beck and Bruce is pretty iron at this point. So in one sense, he has no claim to the crown, but in another sense, he's almost acting like a king already. In a sense, not completely, but in a way he is. So Wallace crowned king. Many Scottish nobles, no doubt of Norman lineage, whose lands and titles stemmed from the Davidian Revolution, were opposed to the idea. A compromise was reached, wherein Wallace would accept the crown, but only for a single day. With Wallace crowned king before England's emissaries, which was more for show than anything else, the Parliament and King Edward were out of options now. They had no choice but to face Wallace and his army on an open field, or be proven to be oath breakers and cowards. I'll let you guess which ended up unfolding. But the Davidian Revolution, I'll maybe do a series on that one day, just to briefly summarise it. King David I of Scotland, the youngest son of Malcolm III Canmore, and Queen Margaret, he grew up in the Anglo-Norman court. So he knew that sooner or later in his kingdom in Scotland, they were going to have to deal with the Anglo-Normans. So instead of trying to fight them, which is what the Irish tried to do, and you can look into how that went for them, he decided instead to invite them in, and he created this hybridized system of kind of Anglo-Norman sort of in the lowlands, whereas in the northern part of Scotland, it was more the old Gaelic Pictish system. Again, I'm oversimplifying an awful lot here. I'm kind of glazing it over, but a lot of Wallace's loyal friends, like John the Graham, were of Norman lineage. Robert Boyd sounds Norman as well. A lot of his chief officers had Norman blood, Norman or Norman Anglo-Norman lineage, but Wallace himself didn't. That's the thing. Wallace was almost completely like a throwback to the past. This Celto sort of Saxon Brittonic blood with Wallace. I don't think he had any Norman lineage at all. So because a lot of his chief lieutenants and officers had that Norman blood, this is where the English Parliament and where Edward are trying to kind of divide them, but it doesn't work. It actually gets turned around on them. It's pretty clever. Queen Margaret of France. So the Scots marched further into England until they were within 25 miles of London, just outside St. Albans. Queen Margaret of France approached her husband and said that she would face Wallace to save England. It was well known that the Scots under Wallace never harmed priests, children, or women, so she'd be perfectly safe. Not only that, she was the sister of King Philip the Fair. So she's the wife and queen consort to one king and the sister of another. So Wallace is obviously not going to lay a finger on her. But this is kind of embarrassing. None of the knights or captains or lords or earls or anything like that are willing to face Wallace, and yet here's this teenage girl, I think she was 18 or 19 at the time, going before King Edward saying, "I will face him. Even though all your captains and your lords wouldn't face him, I'll go face him." It's kind of embarrassing. It's it's really embarrassing for England that a teenage French girl was the person who saved their entire kingdom from being completely destroyed. No wonder this is expunged from the history books. No wonder this book cost £100. And I bought it twice. Once for myself and once from a neighbour. Pretty embarrassing. Terms of truce. So when the Queen approached the Scots, Wallace was weary, suspicious that it was a ploy to poison himself and his officers. See, Wallace is not stupid, you know. The Queen soon won him over, though, with her charm and sincerity. He agreed to negotiate terms of truce. The English agreed to most of Wallace's demands, returning hostages and castles back into Scottish hands. Wallace had brought England to her knees, but had failed to finish her off. And it was the charms of a woman who won him over in the end, you know. All of England's armies couldn't do it. You know, that King Edward couldn't do it. Bishop Beck couldn't do it. Earl Corspatrick couldn't do it. But all it took was the charms of a French teenage girl to disarm him and make him reconsider. This is the power of the feminine. This is a true power of the feminine, you know, but we'll not go down that road. King Philip IV of France. So Wallace returned home and travelled the length of the land 3 times, restoring peace and prosperity. King Philip IV of France, Philip the Fair, Queen Margaret's brother, took notice of Wallace and invited him to his royal court. Well, the royal court, whichever you prefer. Wallace accepted this gracious invitation, though he took a great deal of caution in his plans to leave Scotland. Thomas de Longueville. So Wallace was weary that if word got out that he had left the country, the English would try to sneak back in and take over. He chose a handful of trusted friends to accompany him and set sail for France. Wallace and his men encountered an unexpected problem when they reached the open sea. A notorious French pirate called Thomas de Longueville, the Red Reaver, set his sights on Wallace's ship, the port of Rochelle. So the ship's captain panicked, but Wallace took the situation in hand and used clever tactics to overpower and redeem the infamous pirate. Thomas forever after remained a true lifelong friend to both Wallace and later King Robert the Bruce. Wallace ordered Thomas's men to remain at the port of Rochelle while he tried to obtain for them a royal pardon. And that concludes part 5. As always, leave your thoughts and comments below, and see you the next time.